Evelyn Marsh was 73 years old, and she was sitting in a leather chair that cost more than 3 months of her pension, in a law office that smelled of mahogany and old money, and the particular brand of aftershave that her late husband's eldest son wore like a uniform. The chair was uncomfortable in the way that expensive things often are, designed to impress rather than comfort, to remind you of your position rather than put you at ease. Evelyn sat very still in it, her hands folded in her lap, her green eyes steady behind the delicate silver-framed glasses she had worn for the past 15 years, since the ophthalmologist had told her that 44 years of reading children's essays and writing on chalkboards had taken their inevitable toll on her vision. She was wearing her dusty rose cardigan. The one Arthur had said made her look like a woman from a painting, and beneath it, a cream linen blouse that she had ironed that morning with the careful precision of someone who understood that the small rituals of daily life were sometimes all that stood between a person and the abyss of grief. Arthur had been dead for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the phone call from the hospital at 2 in the morning. 6 weeks since she had driven through dark streets with her heart hammering against her ribs. 6 weeks since she had arrived too late, 10 minutes too late, the nurse had said, her voice gentle with the practiced kindness of someone who delivers this particular message multiple times a week. Arthur Marsh, 76 years old, retired architect, husband of Evelyn, for 41 years. He had died of a cardiac arrest in a hospital bed, while his wife was pulling on her shoes in the dark, trying not to panic, trying to remember where she had left her car keys. 10 minutes, the distance between a goodbye and silence. Evelyn had stood in the hospital corridor and felt the world shift beneath her feet, felt the architecture of her life, the carefully constructed framework of routines and responsibilities and shared meals and whispered conversations in the dark before sleep, collapse as quietly and completely as a house of cards in a breeze. Now she was sitting in this expensive chair, in this wood-paneled office on the 4th floor of a building that Arthur had designed 30 years ago, listening to a lawyer named Henderson read Arthur's will. Henderson was a thin man, with a thin voice and thin lips that barely moved when he spoke, as if he were rationing his words, doling them out with the same careful economy that lawyers apply to billable hours. The office was full. Craig was there, Arthur's eldest from his first marriage, 48 years old, sitting in the chair closest to Henderson's desk with the proprietary ease of a man who considered proximity to power his birthright. Craig had his father's broad shoulders but none of his warmth, his father's sharp jaw but none of his gentleness. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him like armor, a burgundy silk tie knotted with aggressive precision, and shoes that had been polished to a mirror finish. His dark hair was slicked back from a receding hairline. His narrow brown eyes moved across the room with the calculated patience of someone who already knew the outcome and was simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. Craig's younger sister, Diane, was there too. 45, blonde, nervous, wearing too much perfume and not enough conviction. She had always been the gentler of Arthur's first children, but gentleness in the Marsh family was a liability, not a virtue, and Diane had learned early to follow Craig's lead in all things financial, all things familial, all things that required the kind of ruthlessness that Diane possessed only in theory. There were 2 other relatives, cousins or nephews, Evelyn wasn't sure, who sat along the wall like spectators at a proceeding whose outcome had been predetermined. And then there was Evelyn, in her dusty rose cardigan and her silver-framed glasses, the woman who had married Arthur Marsh when his first wife had left him, who had stepped into a family that had never quite accepted her, who had spent 41 years loving a man whose children regarded her not as a mother or even a stepmother, but as an interloper, an obstacle, a woman who had somehow inserted herself into their father's life and, by extension, into their inheritance. Henderson read the will with the flat intonation of a man who had read thousands of wills and had long since stopped being moved by the distribution of dead people's assets. The house on Maple Ridge Drive, the house where Evelyn and Arthur had lived for 38 years, where Evelyn had painted the kitchen yellow because Arthur said it reminded him of sunlight. Is where she had planted roses along the front walk and tended them every spring with the same devotion she brought to her classroom, went to Craig. The investment accounts, which Arthur had built carefully over decades of architectural commissions and careful saving, were divided between Craig and Diane, with smaller portions to the cousins. The car, the furniture, the books, the art collection that Arthur had assembled, with the passionate eye of a man who believed beautiful things deserved to be owned by people who could see their beauty. All of it went to his children. Craig received the largest share. Diane received what Craig allowed her to receive. The cousins received tokens. And Evelyn, who had slept beside Arthur Marsh for 14,965 nights, who had cooked his meals and washed his clothes and held his hand through 2 surgeries and a bout of pneumonia that had nearly killed him 7 years ago, who had given up her own dreams of travel and adventure to maintain the household that Arthur needed in order to do his work. Evelyn received the greenhouse. The greenhouse. Evelyn heard the word and felt it land in the center of her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The Victorian greenhouse on the half-acre lot behind the Marsh family estate, a structure that had been abandoned for decades, its wrought iron frame rusting, its glass panels cracked and missing, its interior overgrown with whatever managed to survive without human attention. Nobody wanted the greenhouse. Nobody had wanted it for 20 years. It was, by every reasonable measure, worthless, a liability rather than an asset, a structure that would cost more to demolish than the land beneath it was worth. Henderson read the bequest with the same flat tone he had used for everything else, but Evelyn could hear the subtext beneath his words, the unspoken acknowledgement that this was not an inheritance, but an insult, not a gift, but a dismissal. Craig made a sound. It took Evelyn a moment to realize it was laughter, not loud, not dramatic, but a quiet, satisfied exhalation through his nose, the kind of sound a man makes when something has gone exactly as he planned. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at Evelyn, but making sure she could see the curve of his lips, and he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried across the silent room with the precision of a blade, "Enjoy your glass coffin." Evelyn, nobody in the room objected. Diane looked at her hands. The cousins shifted in their chairs. Henderson continued reading, his thin voice moving through the remaining details with the efficiency of a man who billed by the quarter hour. Evelyn sat in the expensive leather chair and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because the will was Arthur's final word, and she had spent 41 years respecting his words even when they confused her, even when they hurt her, even when they left her standing in rooms full of people who wished she weren't there. She had loved Arthur. She had loved him completely, unreservedly, with the kind of devotion that does not calculate its return on investment, that does not keep ledgers of sacrifice and reward. And Arthur had left her a greenhouse, a crumbling, abandoned, worthless greenhouse that his own son had called a glass coffin. The months after the will reading were the loneliest of Evelyn's life, and Evelyn Marsh had known loneliness before. She had grown up an only child in a house where her father was frequently absent, and her mother coped with that absence by gardening, spending hours in the backyard among flowers and vegetables, creating a world of growth and color that compensated for the emotional barrenness inside the house. Evelyn had learned from her mother that plants were reliable in ways that people sometimes were not, that a seed planted with care and watered with consistency would always, eventually grow. She had carried this understanding into her career, becoming an elementary school teacher at 24 and remaining one for 44 years. Tending classrooms full of small children with the same patient attention her mother had given her garden beds, believing that every child, like every seed, contained within itself the potential for something remarkable if only someone would provide the proper conditions for growth. But now, at 73, there were no classrooms and no children and no garden beds. There was only a small rented room on the second floor of a house owned by a woman named Mrs. Gentry, who was kind in a distracted way, and who rented the room for an amount that was almost reasonable if Evelyn was very careful with her pension. The room had one window that looked out onto a street lined with oak trees, whose leaves were just beginning to turn the amber and gold of autumn. It had a narrow bed, by a dresser with a mirror that showed Evelyn her own face every morning, older than she expected, thinner, the green eyes behind the silver glasses carrying a weight that hadn't been there 6 months ago. She had brought with her one suitcase, a brown leather case with brass clasps that had been her mother's, packed with the few things Craig had allowed her to take from the house on Maple Ridge Drive: photographs, her teaching certificates, a few pieces of jewelry that Arthur had given her over the years. Nothing expensive, nothing Craig would have wanted, just small tokens of affection that carried emotional weight disproportionate to their monetary value: a silver locket, a pair of pearl earrings, a bracelet with a charm shaped like a book, because Arthur had known that Evelyn's first love, before him, had been reading. Craig had given her 3 weeks to vacate the house, 3 weeks to dismantle 41 years of shared life, to sort through decades of accumulated existence and determine what belonged to her and what belonged to the estate, which was to say, what belonged to Craig. She had moved through the house like a ghost, touching surfaces that held memories, standing in rooms where she could still hear echoes of conversations that would never be continued. The kitchen, where she had cooked thousands of meals, where the yellow paint she had chosen was now slightly faded but still warm, still the color of sunlight. The living room, where Arthur's drawing table still stood by the window, covered now with a cloth, because nobody wanted to look at the emptiness where his work had been. The bedroom, where the indent of his body was still faintly visible in the mattress, where his pillow still held the ghost of his scent if she pressed her face into it hard enough and closed her eyes and pretended that time was something that could be reversed by the force of wanting. She had packed her suitcase and left. Craig had watched from the driveway, leaning against his car with his arms crossed, making sure she didn't take anything that wasn't explicitly listed in the will's meager bequest. Diane had stood at the window upstairs, looking down, and Evelyn thought she might have seen tears on Diane's face, but she couldn't be sure, and it didn't matter anymore. Evelyn had walked to her car, the old Subaru that Arthur had always meant to replace but never did, and she had driven away from the house on Maple Ridge Drive for the last time, even watching it grow smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind a curve in the road. And then she had pulled over and cried for 20 minutes in a grocery store parking lot, sitting behind the wheel with her forehead against her hands, weeping with the kind of thoroughness that 41 years of love and loss require. In the rented room, Evelyn established a routine, because routine was the only thing she knew how to build. She woke early, as she always had. The body remembers its patterns long after the reasons for them have evaporated. She made coffee in the small kitchenette that Mrs. Gentry allowed her to use, measuring the grounds with the careful precision of a woman who could not afford to waste anything. She ate breakfast slowly, reading the newspaper that Mrs. Gentry left on the kitchen table, absorbing information about a world that continued to function despite the fact that Evelyn's portion of it had collapsed. She took walks in the afternoon, following the oak-lined streets of the neighborhood, noting how the leaves progressed through their autumn transformation, green to gold to amber to brown to bare, as if the trees were demonstrating, for her benefit, the natural cycle of loss and renewal that governs all living things. She thought about Arthur constantly, but not in the way she expected. She did not think about his death, or the hospital corridor, or the 10 minutes that had separated her from goodbye. Instead, she thought about his life, the small moments that accumulate over 41 years and become, in retrospect, the substance of a marriage. The way he hummed while he worked at his drawing table, a tuneless, unconscious sound that meant he was deeply concentrated. The way he always poured her coffee first, even after decades, even when the gesture had become so automatic that neither of them noticed it anymore. The way he had looked at her on their wedding day, not the staged look for the photographer, but the private look he had given her in the car afterward, when they were alone for the first time as husband and wife, a look that contained more truth than any vow spoken in a church. She thought about these things, and she missed him with a ferocity that was physical, that lived in her chest like a second heartbeat, that woke her at 3 in the morning and kept her company in the dark hours before dawn. But there was something else beneath the grief, something that surfaced gradually in the weeks after the will reading, the way a stone becomes visible at the bottom of a stream as the water slowly clears. It was confusion. Arthur had been a careful man, a deliberate man, an architect who understood that every decision in a design had consequences, that nothing in a well-built structure was accidental. He had designed buildings that would stand for a century. He had planned projects years in advance, anticipating problems that others wouldn't notice for decades. And yet his will, the final design of his life, the blueprint for what would remain after he was gone, had left Evelyn with nothing, a greenhouse, a crumbling, worthless greenhouse. It didn't make sense. It didn't match the man she had known, the man who had poured her coffee first every morning for 41 years. The man who had looked at her in the car on their wedding day, with eyes that promised everything. Unless the greenhouse wasn't worthless, unless Arthur had known something, unless the greenhouse was not the insult it appeared to be, but something else entirely, a message, a direction, a final act of love disguised as abandonment. Evelyn turned this possibility over in her mind the way she might turn over a stone in a garden, looking at what lay beneath, examining it from every angle. And as she did, she remembered something that she had not thought about in years, a memory so distant and so seemingly insignificant that it had been buried beneath decades of more pressing concerns, waiting in the sediment of her subconscious for the moment when it would finally be needed. Arthur's sister, Rose. He had been the only member of the Marsh family who had ever made Evelyn feel welcome. Rose was 15 years older than Arthur, a generation apart, really, and she had possessed a quality that the rest of the Marshes lacked entirely: genuine warmth. Where Craig and Diane regarded Evelyn with suspicion and resentment, Rose had regarded her with something close to love. Rose had been the one to pull Evelyn aside at family gatherings and ask how she was really doing, not with the perfunctory politeness that the others occasionally managed, but with the focused attention of someone who actually wanted to know the answer. Rose had been a botanist by training and a gardener by passion, a woman who had spent her life studying the secret lives of plants. Who understood root systems and pollination cycles and the miraculous chemistry by which a seed transforms sunlight and water into something alive and beautiful. She had never married, had never had children of her own, had instead poured her love and her intelligence into the greenhouse, the Victorian greenhouse that had been built in 1891 by the original Marsh patriarch, a structure of wrought iron and glass that Rose had maintained with the same devotion that Evelyn brought to her classrooms. Rose had died 8 years ago, quietly, in a hospice where the windows looked out onto a garden that someone else maintained. Evelyn had visited her there every week for the last 3 months of her life, driving the 40 minutes each way, because Arthur couldn't bear to see his sister in that condition, and Craig couldn't be bothered. It was during one of those visits, the second to last as it turned out, that Rose had said the thing that Evelyn was now remembering with sudden, urgent clarity. They had been sitting together in Rose's room, which Rose had asked the hospice to fill with plants. Small pots of herbs and flowers that she could see from her bed, that she could smell when the afternoon light warmed them and released their fragrance into the air. Rose had been having a good day, which in hospice terms meant a day when the pain was manageable and the mind was clear, and the dying person could almost forget, for an hour or two, that they were dying. They had been talking about the greenhouse. Rose had been worried about it, not in the anxious, scattered way of someone losing their grip on reality, but in the focused, a deliberate way of someone who had unfinished business and was running out of time to finish it. "Promise me something, Evelyn," Rose had said, reaching for Evelyn's hand with fingers that were thin and cool, but surprisingly strong. "Promise me you'll tend the greenhouse. I know it looks like nothing now. I know it's fallen apart. I know nobody else cares about it. But the greenhouse keeps what the family forgot, dear. Promise me you'll tend it." Evelyn had promised. She had promised the way you promise a dying woman, something that seems harmless and possibly meaningless, with sincerity and without understanding, with the willingness to say yes, because saying yes was the kindest thing she could do. She had not asked Rose what she meant by what the family forgot. She had assumed it was the sentimental attachment of a botanist to her life's work, the natural grief of a woman who knew that the garden she had tended for decades would be neglected after her death. She had squeezed Rose's hand and told her not to worry, that the greenhouse would be cared for, that Rose's work would be honored. And then Rose had closed her eyes, and within a week she was gone, and the promise had been absorbed into the general grief of loss and the continuing demands of daily life, filed away in that part of memory where the things we mean to do eventually accumulate until they are either fulfilled or forgotten. But now, 8 years later, sitting in her rented room, with her pension stretching thinner each month and the autumn deepening outside her window, Evelyn heard Rose's voice again, not as a memory, but as a directive. The greenhouse keeps what the family forgot. It was not a sentimental remark. It was an instruction. Rose, who had been a scientist, who had spent her life observing and cataloging and understanding the hidden mechanisms of the natural world, had been trying to tell Evelyn something specific, something important, something that Rose had known Evelyn would eventually need to understand, even if she couldn't understand it at the time. Evelyn made her decision on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the oaks outside her window had shed most of their leaves, and the sky was the particular shade of gray that precedes the first frost. She packed her mother's brown leather suitcase with a change of clothes, a flashlight, her gardening gloves. She had kept them, the old leather ones with the worn fingertips, because some tools are too much a part of you to leave behind, and a thermos of coffee. She drove south for 2 hours, through countryside that grew increasingly rural and quiet, past farms with white fences and orchards with bare branches, and small towns with churches whose steeples caught the weak autumn sun. She drove with her hands steady on the wheel, and her heart beating with something she had not felt in months. Not hope exactly, but its precursor, the cautious willingness to believe that hope might still be possible. The Marsh family estate appeared first, the large stone house set back from the road behind iron gates, the property where Arthur had grown up and where Craig now lived with his wife, and the certainty that he had inherited everything worth having. Evelyn did not slow down as she passed it. She continued on the narrow road that ran along the estate's boundary wall, past the old stone wall that marked the edge of the property, and then she turned onto a dirt track that she almost missed, half hidden by overgrown hedgerows, that led to the half-acre lot where the greenhouse stood. The lot was more overgrown than she remembered. The last time she had been here was for Rose's memorial service, 8 years ago, when the family had gathered briefly and uncomfortably at the greenhouse to acknowledge Rose's connection to it before retreating to the main house for drinks, and the kind of conversation that families have when they are performing an obligation rather than feeling grief. Since then, the lot had returned to a state of near wilderness. The stone walls that bordered it were covered in thick moss and climbing ivy. The path from the road to the greenhouse was barely visible beneath layers of fallen leaves and encroaching undergrowth. Wild roses had claimed the fence line, their thorny canes creating a natural barrier that seemed almost intentional, as if the land itself was protecting what lay within from casual intrusion. And there, at the center of it all, stood the greenhouse. Evelyn stopped the car and sat for a long moment, looking at it through the windshield, feeling something shift in her chest, the same shift she had felt years ago when she first walked into a classroom and understood, with a certainty that required no explanation, that this was where she belonged. The Victorian greenhouse was beautiful in its decay. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed, and it surprised her, because she had expected to feel only sadness at the sight of Rose's life's work in ruin. But there was a quality to the structure that transcended its deterioration, a grace in the wrought iron frame with its ornate scrollwork, now rusted to a deep reddish brown that seemed to glow in the weak autumn sunlight. The iron curves and arabesques that the original builder had fashioned in 1891 were still visible despite the corrosion, still elegant, and still speaking of an era when even functional structures were designed with beauty as a primary consideration. The glass panels told a different story. Dozens were cracked, some were missing entirely, replaced by the open sky and the weather it brought. Where glass remained, it was clouded with age and mineral deposits, creating a translucent quality that diffused the light passing through it into something softer and more complex than simple sunlight. Climbing ivy and wild roses had scaled the exterior, threading through the iron framework, creating a living lattice of green and rust that was, in its own accidental way, more beautiful than anything a human designer could have deliberately created. Evelyn got out of the car and retrieved her suitcase from the trunk. See, she was not sure why she had brought it. The suitcase contained nothing she would need for a visit to a greenhouse, but it felt right to have it with her, the way it had felt right to carry it when she left the house on Maple Ridge Drive, as if the suitcase were not just a container for her belongings, but a talisman, a connection to the women who had carried it before her. A physical reminder that she came from a line of people who had survived displacement and loss and had carried forward, in battered leather cases, with brass clasps, the evidence of their resilience. She walked the overgrown path to the greenhouse entrance, stepping carefully over roots and stones that had been heaved up by years of frost and thaw. The air was different here than in town, cooler, more complex, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth and something else, something green and alive that seemed impossible this late in the season. Evelyn recognized the smell. It was the smell of a greenhouse in winter, the trapped warmth, the humidity created by living things, transpiring in an enclosed space, the particular fragrance that plants produce when they are growing in conditions that the outside world does not support. But this greenhouse had been abandoned for 8 years. Nobody had tended it. Nobody had watered it. Nobody had done anything to maintain the conditions that plants required to survive through winter. And yet the smell was there, unmistakable, carrying the message that something inside was not just surviving, but thriving. The door was wrought iron and glass, like the rest of the structure, and it was stuck, not locked, but swollen with moisture, and wedged into its frame by years of settling and rust. Evelyn set down her suitcase and used both hands, pulling with a strength that surprised her, the kind of strength that comes not from muscles but from necessity. The door resisted, then yielded suddenly with a sound like a gasp, metal scraping against metal, glass rattling in its iron frame, and swung open, releasing a wave of warm, humid air that hit Evelyn's face like a breath from another world. She stepped inside and stopped. She could not move. She could not speak. She could only stand in the doorway of Rose's greenhouse and look at what 8 years of abandonment had produced. And what she saw made her press her hand against her mouth to contain the sound that rose in her throat. A sound that was part gasp and part sob and part something that had no name. The sound a person makes when they encounter something so unexpected and so beautiful that the human vocabulary simply fails. The greenhouse was alive, not just alive in the ordinary sense of a few hardy weeds surviving in the cracks, alive in the extraordinary sense of a carefully curated botanical collection that had somehow maintained itself, had continued to grow and bloom and reproduce in the absence of human care, as if the plants themselves possessed an intelligence and a will to survive that exceeded anything Evelyn had imagined possible. The rows of weathered wooden benches that lined both sides of the greenhouse were covered with clay pots, dozens of them, and in those pots grew orchids. But these were not the ordinary orchids you might find in a grocery store or a garden center. These were extraordinary, varieties Evelyn had never seen, in colors she had not known orchids could produce. Deep, impossible violets that seemed to contain their own light source. Whites so pure they appeared luminescent, glowing in the diffused light that filtered through the remaining glass panels. Golds that shimmered with an iridescence that seemed almost metallic. Reds that were not merely red, but a complex, layered crimson that shifted and changed as Evelyn moved through the space, as if the flowers were responding to her presence, adjusting their display for an audience they had been waiting years to receive. Evelyn moved through the greenhouse slowly, afraid to disturb anything, afraid that what she was seeing might be a hallucination produced by grief and loneliness and the desperation of a woman who needed something, anything, to mean something. She reached out and touched one of the orchids, a deep violet specimen whose petals were the size of her palm, and the flower was real, solid, warm, alive, its texture velvety beneath her fingertips, its stem strong and green and vigorous. She touched another, a white orchid with petals that seemed to be veined with gold, like a piece of porcelain so fine that light passed through it. Real, all of it real. Rose had not just maintained a greenhouse. Rose had created something miraculous, a collection of orchids so rare, so unusual, so unlike anything Evelyn had encountered in a lifetime of gardening and teaching children about the natural world, that their existence in this crumbling Victorian structure in the middle of a neglected lot felt like a violation of the natural order, like finding a cathedral in a cave, like finding a symphony in a silence. Evelyn walked the length of the greenhouse 3 times, counting. She counted 147 pots. Some contained single plants, others held clusters of 3 or 4 specimens. The orchids were arranged by color, the violets at one end, transitioning through blues and whites in the middle to golds and reds at the far end, creating a spectrum that was clearly deliberate, clearly designed, clearly the work of someone who understood both the science and the art of botanical cultivation. Rose had done this. Rose, with her scientist's mind and her gardener's heart, had spent years, perhaps decades, building this collection, in cultivating varieties that Evelyn was beginning to suspect were not just rare, but genuinely unique, specimens that existed nowhere else on Earth, that Rose had bred and crossbred and nurtured into existence through the patient application of knowledge and love. The question was how. How had the orchids survived 8 years without human care? How had they continued to bloom in a greenhouse with broken panels, exposed to winter temperatures that should have killed them? Evelyn knelt beside one of the benches and examined the system that Rose had built. The pots were sitting in trays of gravel and water, self-watering systems that Rose had designed to maintain consistent moisture levels. The gravel trays were fed by a thin copper pipe that ran along the base of each bench, connected to what? Evelyn followed the pipe with her eyes, tracing it along the bench to the wall, where it disappeared through the iron frame and descended into the earth below. A water source. Rose had connected the greenhouse to an underground water supply, possibly a natural spring, possibly a diverted stream, that provided consistent gravity-fed irrigation without any need for human intervention. The system was brilliant in its simplicity, designed by a woman who understood that she would not always be there to tend her creation and who had planned accordingly. But the water system explained only the orchids' survival, not their extraordinary nature. For that, Evelyn needed to understand what Rose had actually been doing in this greenhouse for all those years, what she had been growing and why she had kept it secret. And for that understanding, Evelyn would need to look beyond the greenhouse itself to the small stone potting shed that was attached to the rear of the structure, a shed whose wooden door was swollen shut, whose existence Evelyn had almost forgotten, but which Rose had mentioned once, years ago, in a conversation that Evelyn was only now beginning to understand, had been a map, drawn in words, leading to exactly this moment. The potting shed was built of the same stone as the walls that bordered the lot. Local fieldstone, gray and solid, fitted together with the careful craftsmanship of an era that valued permanence over convenience. The door was heavy wood, oak perhaps, weathered to a silver gray that matched the stone. It had no lock, just an iron latch that had rusted into position. Evelyn worked at it with her gardening gloves, off the old leather ones with the worn fingertips, pressing and pulling and twisting until the rust finally gave way, and the latch lifted with a reluctant metallic groan. The door required the same determined effort as the greenhouse entrance, swollen in its frame, resistant to opening, as if it were guarding what lay within. Evelyn leaned her shoulder into it and pushed, feeling the wood scrape against the stone threshold, and the door opened into darkness. The potting shed smelled of earth and clay and the particular mineral scent of old stone. Evelyn pulled the flashlight from her suitcase and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a space that was smaller than she expected, but meticulously organized. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls, holding clay pots of various sizes, bags of potting soil, coils of copper wire, and the tools of a dedicated gardener, trowels and pruning shears and watering cans, all arranged with the precision of a woman who believed that proper tool maintenance was a form of respect. A wooden workbench occupied the center of the shed, its surface scarred with decades of use, stained with soil and water and the green marks of stems that had been cut and trimmed there. Rose had spent countless hours in this space, Evelyn realized. This had been her laboratory, her workshop, the private chamber where she conducted the experiments that produced the extraordinary orchids growing in the greenhouse beyond. Evelyn moved around the workbench slowly, running her flashlight across the shelves, looking for something without knowing exactly what she was looking for. She found it when she noticed the floor. The potting shed had a stone floor, heavy flagstones fitted together with narrow gaps filled with packed earth. But in one area, near the back wall beneath the lowest shelf, the stones were different. Not in material or color, they were the same gray field stone as the rest, but in their positioning. 2 of the flagstones had been set with slightly wider gaps between them and the surrounding stones, and the packed earth in those gaps was not the same compacted decades-old fill that surrounded the other stones. It was looser, darker, more recently disturbed. Someone had lifted these stones and replaced them. Someone had accessed the space beneath this floor. Evelyn knelt on the cold stone and worked her fingers into the gap around the first flagstone. Her hands were 73 years old, marked by decades of chalkboard dust and classroom work and the small cuts and calluses of a lifetime of gardening, but they were still nimble, still capable, still the hands of a woman who had spent her life doing precise, careful work. She gripped the edge of the stone and lifted. It was heavy, perhaps 30 pounds, and it came up slowly, revealing a cavity beneath that had been deliberately excavated, a space roughly 2 feet square and 18 inches deep, lined with plastic sheeting to keep out moisture. Inside the cavity, wrapped in canvas and sealed in heavy-duty plastic bags, were documents. Evelyn's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in the thin skin of her temples. She lifted the first package out carefully, reverently, the way she might lift a rare book or a fragile artifact, understanding with a certainty that went beyond logic that what she held in her hands was the answer to a question she had not known she was asking until 6 weeks ago, when Henderson had read the word greenhouse in that wood-paneled office and Craig had called it a glass coffin. She carried the packages out of the potting shed and into the greenhouse, where the late afternoon light was filtering through the remaining glass panels in slanting beams that caught the dust motes and the humid air and transformed them into something that looked like liquid gold. She sat on the stone step between the shed and the greenhouse, surrounded by orchids in impossible colors, and she began to unwrap what Rose had left for her. The first document was a deed, not the greenhouse deed that Henderson had read during the will. This was different, older, even more detailed. It was the original deed to the half-acre lot, dated 1952, and it showed something that made Evelyn's hands stop moving on the paper. The lot had never been part of the Marsh family estate. Rose had purchased it independently, with her own money, 62 years ago. The lot, and everything on it, including the greenhouse, was Rose's personal property, separate from the family holdings, separate from Arthur's estate, separate from anything that Craig or Diane or Henderson or any lawyer could claim jurisdiction over. Rose had bought it before she was 30, before Craig was born, before Evelyn had even met Arthur. And Rose had, 12 years ago, transferred ownership of the lot to Evelyn Marsh. The deed bore Evelyn's name, witnessed and notarized, recorded with the county, illegal and binding and completely unknown to anyone in the Marsh family except Rose herself. Evelyn read the deed 3 times. Each time the words remained the same. The lot belonged to her, had belonged to her for 12 years. Not because of Arthur's will, not because of Henderson's reading, not because Craig had deemed it worthless and thrown it at her like a bone to a dog, but because Rose had chosen to give it to her, had planned this transfer with the deliberate care of a woman who understood that someday Evelyn would need it, who had known, with the prescient certainty of someone who had watched the Marsh family dynamics for 70 years, that Arthur's children would leave Evelyn with nothing, and who had built a safety net so carefully concealed that nobody, not Craig, not the lawyers, not even Arthur himself, had known it existed. The second set of documents were botanical certification papers. Evelyn did not fully understand the technical language, but she understood enough. The papers, issued by 3 different international botanical authorities, certified that the orchids in Rose's greenhouse included 17 varieties that were classified as critically endangered, species that the scientific community believed to be extinct, or nearly so, surviving only in the most remote habitats on Earth. Except that Rose had them. Rose had collected specimens over decades of botanical research, had bred them and crossbred them and developed new varieties that combined the genetic material of multiple endangered species. The collection in the greenhouse was not just rare. It was, according to the certification papers, the most significant private orchid collection in the Western Hemisphere. Several of the varieties existed nowhere else. Rose had created them. The third set of documents were letters, correspondence between Rose and botanical collectors, university research departments, pharmaceutical companies, and conservation organizations from around the world. The letters spanned 20 years, and they told a story that made Evelyn's head spin with numbers and possibilities. Collectors had offered enormous sums for individual specimens. Universities had requested access for research purposes, offering grants and partnerships. A pharmaceutical company in Switzerland had expressed interest in certain orchid varieties whose chemical compounds showed potential for medical applications. The offers ranged from tens of thousands of dollars for single rare specimens to hundreds of thousands for access to Rose's breeding methodology and genetic library. Rose had declined them all. She had kept her collection secret, had maintained it in the crumbling greenhouse, had refused to sell or share or publicize what she had created. She had been waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right person. And then Evelyn found the letter. Rose's letter. The final document in the final package, sealed in its own envelope, addressed in Rose's precise, elegant handwriting. For Evelyn, when the time comes. Evelyn opened the envelope with trembling hands, carefully tearing the seal that Rose had pressed closed years ago, perhaps at this very workbench, and perhaps surrounded by the same orchids that now bore silent witness to the opening. The letter was written on cream-colored stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. Rose had always kept lavender sachets in her drawers and in her stationery box, a habit from a time when personal correspondence was an art form, and even the paper it was written on was chosen to convey something about the writer. The handwriting was Rose's, precise, slanted slightly to the right, each letter formed with the careful attention of a woman who had been educated in an era when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. Evelyn began to read, and as she did, the greenhouse seemed to grow quieter around her, as if the orchids themselves were listening, as if the building that had held Rose's secrets for decades was finally gratefully releasing them into the hands of the person they were always meant for. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have come to the greenhouse, and I am grateful. I have waited a long time for this moment, not with anxiety, but with the patient certainty of a gardener who knows that every seed has its season, that some things must be planted years or decades before they bloom, and that the gardener's job is not to force the timing, but to prepare the conditions and trust the process. I want you to understand something about this greenhouse and about the collection it contains. When I was a young woman, long before Arthur was born, I fell in love with orchids. Not the common varieties that you find in shops. Those are lovely, but they are not what drew me. I fell in love with the rare ones. So the endangered ones, the species that were disappearing from the earth because the habitats they required were being destroyed by human carelessness and greed. I spent my career studying them, traveling to places where they still grew wild, collecting specimens with the permission of the governments and conservation organizations that understood that preservation sometimes requires cultivation, that the best way to save a species from extinction is to ensure that it survives somewhere, even if that somewhere is a greenhouse in the middle of a family property that nobody else values. Over 50 years, I assembled what I believe to be the most comprehensive collection of endangered orchid genetics in private hands. 17 species that the world believes are extinct continue to bloom in this greenhouse. 34 hybrid varieties that I developed exist nowhere else on Earth. The breeding notes, the genetic records, the documentation of my methods, all of it is here, beneath the floor of the potting shed where you found this letter. I kept it secret for one simple reason. The Marsh family would have sold it. Craig would have auctioned off the orchids to the highest bidder, would have dismantled 60 years of careful work for a quick profit, would have scattered this collection across private holdings where the specimens would eventually die without the specific care and conditions I have developed for them. I could not allow that. These orchids are not commodities. They are living things, each one representing decades of patient work, each one carrying genetic material that cannot be replaced if it is lost. They are, in a very real sense, irreplaceable, and they deserve a caretaker who understands what that means. That caretaker is you, Evelyn. I have watched you for 40 years. I have watched you tend your classrooms the way I tend my orchids, with patience, with attention, with the understanding that every living thing under your care deserves the best conditions you can provide. I have watched you love my brother with a generosity that he did not always deserve, with a steadiness that his children never acknowledged, with a faith in the value of devotion that I found deeply moving and profoundly admirable. You are a gardener, Evelyn, even if you have spent most of your life gardening children rather than plants. You understand growth. You understand patience. You understand that the most important work is often the work that nobody sees. The collection is yours. The lot is yours. I transferred it to your name 12 years ago, when I first became ill and understood that I needed to make arrangements. The deed is separate from the Marsh estate and always has been. Craig cannot touch it. The lawyers cannot challenge it. Everything here, the greenhouse, the orchids, the land, and the value they represent, belongs to you, and it has belonged to you for longer than you knew. As for what the collection is worth, I have received offers over the years. The letters are in the documents you've already found. The botanical certification papers establish the rarity and significance of what I've assembled. I was offered, at various times, sums ranging from $50,000 for individual specimens to $600,000 for access to my complete breeding methodology. A conservative estimate of the collection's current value, based on recent market conditions for rare botanical specimens, would be in excess of $1.5 million. But I want you to know that the monetary value, while significant, is not the reason I am giving this to you. I am giving this to you because you are the only person I trust to understand that these orchids are worth more than money, that they represent something that money cannot buy. The accumulated patience and love and scientific devotion of a lifetime, preserved in living form, waiting for someone who would see them not as assets to be liquidated, but as treasures to be protected. Tend the greenhouse, Evelyn. I tend it the way you tended your classrooms, the way you tended my brother, the way you tend everything that falls within your care. The orchids will reward your attention. They always do. And know that I loved you, not as a sister-in-law, which is a relationship defined by legal formality rather than genuine feeling, but as a friend, as a kindred spirit, as someone who understood what it means to devote your life to something beautiful and to do so without expectation of recognition or reward. With all my love, and with the absolute confidence that I have placed my life's work in the right hands, Rose. Evelyn read the letter, and then she read it again, and then she sat among the orchids with the letter pressed against her chest, and she cried. She cried with the thoroughness of a woman who had held herself together through 6 weeks of grief and months of loneliness, and the accumulated humiliation of being dismissed and diminished by people who had never bothered to see her clearly. She cried for Rose, who had loved her in secret, who had built this extraordinary gift over decades of patient work, who had hidden it beneath the floor of a potting shed and trusted that the right person would find it at the right time. She cried for Arthur, who had perhaps known more than his will suggested, who had perhaps insisted on leaving Evelyn the greenhouse because he knew or suspected what Rose had done, what the greenhouse contained, what his sister had been protecting all those years. She cried for herself, for the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming, for the 44 years of teaching and the 41 years of marriage and the 6 weeks of grief that had brought her to this moment, kneeling on the stone floor of a Victorian greenhouse surrounded by orchids that should not exist, holding a letter from a dead woman who had loved her, discovering that she was not worthless after all, that she had never been worthless, that the people who had treated her as if she were disposable had been wrong about her in every way that mattered. The weeks that followed were the busiest of Evelyn's life since her retirement. She hired a lawyer, not Henderson, whose allegiance to the Marsh family was clear, but a young woman named Sophia Chen, who specialized in property law and intellectual property, and who, when Evelyn spread the documents across her conference table and explained what Rose had left her, had gone very quiet for a long moment before saying, "Mrs. Marsh, do you understand what you have here?" Sophia reviewed every document with meticulous care, verifying the deed with the county records office, confirming that the lot had never been part of the Marsh estate, establishing that the transfer to Evelyn's name was legally sound and had been recorded properly 12 years ago. She consulted with botanical experts who confirmed the certification papers, who examined photographs of the orchids that Evelyn had taken on her phone, who responded with the kind of restrained professional excitement that scientists display when they encounter something genuinely unprecedented. The botanical world, it turned out, she had been aware of Rose Marsh. Not widely, Rose had published only a handful of papers over her career, preferring to work in private, but among specialists in orchid conservation, Her name carried a quiet authority. Several prominent botanists had corresponded with Rose over the years, had suspected that her collection was more extensive than she revealed, had hoped that someday her work would become available for study and preservation. When Sophia, on Evelyn's behalf, discreetly contacted these experts, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within weeks, Evelyn had received inquiries from 3 universities, 2 conservation organizations, a botanical garden in England, and a pharmaceutical research company. The offers were substantial. One university proposed a long-term research partnership that would provide Evelyn with annual licensing fees while keeping the collection intact and under her ownership. A conservation trust offered to purchase the breeding rights to several endangered species for a sum that made Evelyn sit down on Rose's stone step and press her hand against her forehead, as if the number might be easier to comprehend if she applied physical pressure to the brain that was struggling to process it. Sophia helped Evelyn navigate the offers with careful attention to both financial value and Rose's wishes. They chose a combination approach, a research partnership with a respected university that would study the orchids and develop conservation programs based on Rose's breeding methodology, combined with selective licensing of certain hybrid varieties to botanical gardens and collectors who met strict criteria for ongoing care. The pharmaceutical company was allowed limited access to study the medicinal properties of specific varieties, under terms that ensured Evelyn retained ownership of all genetic material. The total value of these agreements, the initial payments, the ongoing licensing fees, the research grants, exceeded $1.5 million over a 10-year period, with provisions for renewal that could extend the income indefinitely. Evelyn, who had been stretching her pension to cover rent in Mrs. Gentry's spare room, who had been eating carefully and counting every dollar and lying awake at night wondering how long she could sustain this diminished existence, was suddenly and irrevocably secure. Not wealthy in the way that Craig understood wealth, not the kind of wealth that announces itself with tailored suits and polished shoes and the smug certainty of a man who has inherited everything he possesses, but secure in the way that matters, secure enough to stop worrying, to stop counting, to stop lying awake at 3 in the morning, performing the desperate arithmetic of poverty, secure enough to live. She found a house, a small cottage about 15 miles from the greenhouse, in a town where the people were friendly and the pace of life was slow enough to accommodate a woman who had spent 44 years moving at the speed of children and was not inclined to accelerate. The cottage had a garden, a real garden, with rich soil and good light, and the kind of potential that Evelyn, a daughter of a gardener and lifelong tender of growing things, recognized immediately as something she could work with. She bought the cottage outright, with cash, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had learned that the most profound luxuries are not expensive things, but the absence of financial fear. She furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each piece with the deliberation of someone who had spent 41 years living in spaces that someone else had designed. She chose colors that pleased her, not beige, not the muted neutrals that Craig's interior designer had selected for the house on Maple Ridge Drive, but warm, living colors. A green for the kitchen that reminded her of the greenhouse, a soft gold for the bedroom that reminded her of autumn light, a deep blue for the reading nook that reminded her of nothing except the fact that she liked blue and had never before had the freedom to act on that preference. Craig found out in December. It was inevitable. The botanical community's interest in the collection had generated enough professional chatter that news eventually reached someone who knew someone who mentioned it at a dinner party where Craig happened to be present. Evelyn learned about Craig's discovery not from Craig himself. He did not call her, did not visit, did not extend any direct communication, but from Diane, who called Evelyn on a Wednesday evening with a voice that was equal parts amazement and apology. "He's furious," Diane said. "He's been on the phone with lawyers all week. He says the greenhouse was part of the estate, that Aunt Rose had no right to transfer anything independently, that the whole thing is fraudulent." Diane paused. "He also said some things about you that I'm not going to repeat because they were cruel and untrue, and I'm ashamed that my brother is capable of saying them." Evelyn listened calmly. She was sitting in her new cottage, in the reading nook she had painted blue, wearing her dusty rose cardigan and her silver frame glasses, drinking tea from a cup she had chosen herself. She felt, for the first time in months, genuinely peaceful, not the forced peace of a woman who has resigned herself to her circumstances, but the earned peace of someone who has passed through difficulty and emerged on the other side with something solid beneath her feet. "The lot was never part of the estate, Diane," Evelyn said quietly. "Rose purchased it independently in 1952. The deed is recorded with the county. My lawyer has verified everything. Craig can call all the lawyers he wants. There's nothing to challenge." Diane was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I know. I called because I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry about how we treated you. I'm sorry about the will. I'm sorry that we let Craig convince us that you didn't deserve anything. You deserved everything, Evelyn. You were the best thing that ever happened to Dad. And we were too blind and too selfish to see it." Evelyn thanked her. She meant it. Forgiveness came more easily than she had expected. Not because the hurt had diminished, but because the hurt no longer defined her. She was no longer the woman in the expensive leather chair, clutching a greenhouse deed like a consolation prize. She was something else now. She was a woman with a cottage and a garden, and a greenhouse full of impossible orchids, and a letter from a dead woman who had loved her, and a future that she had earned, not through competition or cunning, but through the simple, persistent, much undervalued act of being worthy of trust. Craig's lawyers sent a letter. Sophia responded with documentation so thorough, so meticulously sourced, so legally airtight that the response arrived like a door closing, quietly, firmly, and with absolute finality. The lot was Rose's. The transfer was legal. The orchids belonged to Evelyn. There was nothing to contest, nothing to challenge, nothing to undo. Craig, for the first time in his life, had encountered a situation that his money and his confidence and his tailored charcoal suits could not alter. He had given Evelyn the greenhouse as an insult, had called it a glass coffin, had laughed in a room full of lawyers while his stepmother sat in an expensive chair and said nothing. And the greenhouse had turned out to be worth more than anything Craig had inherited, more than the house on Maple Ridge Drive, more than the investment accounts, more than the car and the furniture and the art collection that Arthur had assembled with such care. The glass coffin had become a treasure chest, and Craig had locked himself out of it with his own contempt. On a morning in early spring, when the countryside was beginning to stir with the first tentative signs of renewal, snowdrops pushing through cold earth, buds forming on bare branches, the particular quality of light that arrives in March like a promise, Evelyn drove to the greenhouse. She had been visiting regularly since October, tending the orchids with the same patient attention she had once given her students, learning the specific needs of each variety, studying Rose's notes and breeding records, understanding slowly the extraordinary scope of what Rose had accomplished over 6 decades of quiet, determined work. The greenhouse had been stabilized. The university partnership included funding for structural repairs, and a team of specialists had replaced the broken glass panels, reinforced the wrought iron frame, and installed modern climate control systems that worked alongside Rose's original gravity-fed irrigation to maintain optimal conditions for the collection. And Evelyn parked her car and walked the path to the greenhouse, which was no longer overgrown. She had cleared it herself, stone by stone, reclaiming the walkway that Rose had once used, restoring the approach to the building that Rose had loved. The wild roses still grew along the fence line, but they had been trained now, guided along the stone walls in a way that was both natural and intentional, the way a good teacher guides a student, not by forcing, but by creating the conditions in which growth becomes inevitable. She opened the greenhouse door. It moved smoothly now, the hinges oiled, the frame adjusted, and she stepped inside. The orchids greeted her the way they always did, with an explosion of color and fragrance that still, after months of visits, took her breath away. The violets at the far end, the luminescent whites in the center, the shimmering golds, the deep layered crimsons that changed as you moved through the space, responsive and alive and impossibly beautiful. Evelyn set down her brown leather suitcase. She still carried it, would always carry it, because it connected her to her mother and to the woman she had been before all of this. The woman who had walked out of the house on Maple Ridge Drive with nothing but photographs and jewelry and the stubborn, quiet conviction that she was worth more than what had been given to her. She stood in the center of the greenhouse, surrounded by 147 pots of living treasure, and she thought about Rose. She thought about a woman who had spent 60 years building something extraordinary in secret, who had loved her brother's wife without expecting anything in return, who had understood that the most important gifts are sometimes the ones that require decades of preparation and patience, that the best protection is often invisible until the moment it is needed. She thought about her mother, who had taught her that plants were reliable in ways that people sometimes were not. She thought about her students, the thousands of small faces she had seen over 44 years, each one a seed that she had tried to nurture, each one carrying within itself the potential for something remarkable. She thought about Arthur, who had perhaps known more than she realized, who had perhaps fought for the greenhouse bequest not as an insult, but as a compass, pointing her toward what Rose had hidden. The greenhouse keeps what the family forgot. That is what Rose had said, and she had been right. The family had forgotten kindness. They had forgotten loyalty. They had forgotten that a woman who spends 41 years loving someone without reservation, who works night shifts and raises children and maintains a home, and does all of it without complaint or recognition, is not disposable. They had forgotten that worth is not measured in tailored suits and polished shoes and the size of one's inheritance, but in the quality of one's attention, the depth of one's patience, the steadfastness of one's love. Rose had remembered. Rose had kept what the family forgot, had preserved it in living form, in orchids that bloomed in impossible colors, in a greenhouse that everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Evelyn was 73 years old. She had spent 44 years teaching children, 41 years married to a man she loved, and 6 months learning that the end of one story is sometimes the beginning of another. She had been given a greenhouse that a man had called a glass coffin, and she had found inside it not death, but life. Extraordinary, impossible, resilient life that had been waiting for her, patient and faithful, through 8 years of abandonment and 6 decades of secret cultivation, through the death of the woman who created it and the cruelty of the family that never knew it existed. She had found life and love and a future built on something more solid than inheritance or law, or the opinions of men in expensive suits who confuse the price of things with their value. She stood in Rose's greenhouse on a spring morning, surrounded by orchids that should not exist, holding a suitcase that her mother had carried, wearing a cardigan that her husband had loved, and she felt something settle in her chest, something warm and certain and permanent, like a root-finding purchase in good soil. She was home. Not in the geographical sense, the cottage was home in that way, but in the deeper sense, the sense that matters, the sense that means you have found the place where your presence has meaning, where your care is needed, where the accumulated patience and love of your life can be applied to something worthy of it. The greenhouse was that place. Rose had known it, and now Evelyn knew it too. She reached out and touched the nearest orchid, a deep violet specimen, its petals soft as velvet, its stem strong and green, and she whispered to Rose, to the greenhouse, to the impossible collection of living things that had survived abandonment and winter and the indifference of a family that had never deserved them. I'm here now. I'll tend you. I promise. And the orchids, in their impossible colors, seemed to lean toward her, as if they had been waiting for exactly this. The voice of someone who understood that the most important work is the work that nobody sees, that the greatest treasures are hidden in the places that everyone else has given up on, and that love, when it is patient enough, when it is carefully enough planted, can survive anything, even neglect, even time, even the particular cruelty of people who never learned that the things they throw away are sometimes the things worth the most.